It was a bright and sunny afternoon in the heart of the city, and tourists filled the streets, eager to see the famous landmarks. Among them was a young man named Mark, who had traveled from another country for a short vacation. He had seen pictures of the royal guards standing tall and still looking serious, and he was excited to see one in person. As he walked through the crowded square, his eyes scanned the area for the famous guards. And then he saw one. Standing by the grand gates of a historic palace, the royal guard was perfectly still, his posture straight, his uniform neat, and his hat positioned just right. Mark couldn't help but stare. He had heard stories about how serious these guards were, how they wouldn't react to anything, no matter how silly the tourists were. He was fascinated by how they could stand there for hours without moving a muscle. But Mark was feeling a little playful. He was on vacation, and everything seemed new and exciting. He had already taken a few funny pictures with the other tourists, and now he wanted to make his moment with the royal guard special too. Mark walked closer to the guard, his mind racing with ideas. He had already been joking around with his friends earlier, and they were all having a great time. A mischievous thought popped into his head. What if I do something funny with this guard? He thought. He knew the guard wouldn't move or react, and this idea seemed like the perfect opportunity to make a memory. Just then, Mark noticed a small cafe nearby. He walked over to it and bought a large cup of hot coffee. As he held the warm cup in his hand, the idea of the joke started to form in his mind. He would walk up to the guard, pretend to be casual, and then toss the coffee in the air, just as if it was a harmless prank. The thought made Mark laugh a little. His friends would definitely find it funny. He imagined them all watching as the coffee splashed, the guard standing there completely unaffected, like some kind of statue. Mark could already hear the laughter. Without much hesitation, he walked toward the guard, careful not to look suspicious. The guard, of course, showed no sign of noticing him. He was focused on his duty. Mark approached him slowly, trying not to draw attention, but the closer he got, the more excited he became. The other tourists around him were also busy snapping photos, but none of them seemed to notice Mark's plans. He stood directly in front of the royal guard, who didn't even blink. Mark took a deep breath, holding the coffee cup firmly. Then, with a wide grin on his face, he lifted the cup and, without warning, flung the hot coffee in the air. It was meant to land just in front of the guard, splashing the coffee without actually touching him. Mark was laughing, expecting the scene to be hilarious, but as the coffee flew through the air, he didn't realize that things were about to change very quickly. What he didn't expect was that this small joke, which seemed so harmless to him, would lead to something much bigger, something that would soon make headlines. As the hot coffee flew through the air, Mark felt a rush of excitement. The coffee splashed, and for a brief moment, it seemed like everything was going just as he had imagined. The hot liquid hit the guard's uniform and dripped down his chest, but the guard didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Mark stood there for a second, still holding the empty coffee cup in his hand, waiting for a reaction. He expected the guard to shout, get angry, or even start chasing him around. But instead, the guard stayed perfectly still, like a statue. Mark's friends, who had been standing nearby, burst out laughing. They thought it was hilarious, and they quickly pulled out their phones to take videos of the scene. Others in the crowd, some nearby tourists and passers-by, also watched, some with confusion and others with amusement. The silence that followed made Mark feel even more proud of himself. See, he didn't even move. Mark thought, this is going to be a funny story to tell when I get home. He could already picture the laughs as he shared the story with his friends back in his hometown. But then, something strange happened. The royal guard, still silent, didn't react at all. Instead of showing any sign of annoyance or anger, he calmly turned his head, still not speaking, and motioned to one of the other officers who was nearby. The officer looked up from his work and quickly made his way toward the guard. Mark, not fully realizing the seriousness of the situation, took a few steps back, still smiling. "It's just a prank," he thought. "There's no harm in it." He turned to his friends, who were still laughing, and gave them a thumbs up. They seemed to think he was clever, so he figured everything was fine. However, what Mark didn't know was that the situation had taken a turn. The guard, who was still standing motionless, had silently called for help. The officer who had approached him immediately looked around the crowd and saw Mark standing there, still holding the empty coffee cup in his hand. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The officer wasn't smiling or laughing. His face was serious, his eyes narrowed. "What did you just do?" the officer asked sternly. The tone in his voice made Mark's smile fade. It was clear that this wasn't going to be as funny as Mark had thought. Before Mark could explain himself, the officer took another step forward and said, "You'll have to come with me." Mark's stomach dropped. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. The officer's serious expression made it clear that there was no joke here. This was real. The crowd had grown quiet. People started murmuring, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding situation. Mark's friends stopped laughing, realizing that this was no longer a lighthearted prank. Mark, still confused, looked around for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. As the officer stepped closer, Mark realized that this prank had turned into something he hadn't expected at all. It was no longer just about a funny moment with a royal guard. It was about to lead to serious consequences. Mark's heart was pounding in his chest as he tried to understand what was happening. The officer was getting closer, his expression growing more serious with every step. Mark, still holding the empty coffee cup, realized that he had just made a huge mistake. The crowd, which had been laughing and taking pictures a moment ago, had become silent, watching the situation unfold. The officer's gaze never left Mark as he stepped forward. "Come with me," the officer said again, his voice calm but firm. Mark could feel the weight of the officer's words. It was like a chill ran through him as he understood the gravity of what he had done. This wasn't just a harmless joke anymore. It was turning into something more serious. Mark glanced around at his friends, hoping they would step in and help him out of this situation. But they were no longer laughing. Instead, they were staring, unsure of what to do. Some looked a bit nervous, others a bit embarrassed. They had all been part of the prank, but now they saw the officer's serious face and realized that they had crossed a line. Mark's mind raced. He couldn't understand why this was happening. It was just a silly prank. The royal guard hadn't even reacted. Mark tried to explain, but his words seemed to get stuck in his throat. "It was just a joke," he managed to say. "I didn't mean anything by it." But the officer wasn't interested in explanations. He had seen enough. Without saying anything more, he motioned for Mark to follow him. Mark took a step back, unsure of what to do. The last thing he expected was to be treated like a criminal. He had thrown coffee at someone as part of a joke, not a crime. But the seriousness of the situation hit him hard when the officer signaled for more backup. Mark noticed another officer walking toward him from the corner of the square. The new officer was even more serious than the first. Mark felt like he was surrounded. The crowd had gathered closer now, watching the scene as it unfolded, some filming it, others whispering to each other. "I'm sorry. I really didn't mean any harm," Mark said, his voice shaky. He was beginning to panic. He never imagined that throwing coffee at the royal guard would lead to this. He thought it would be a fun memory, something he could laugh about later. But now, it felt like everything was slipping out of his control. The officers didn't respond. They just kept walking, guiding Mark to a small side entrance of the palace, away from the curious eyes of the crowd. The crowd's whispers grew louder as they watched him being escorted by the officers. Mark's face turned red from embarrassment. What had started as a silly joke was now a public spectacle, and he was the center of it. "Please, I just wanted to have some fun," Mark muttered to himself. But it was clear that fun was the last thing anyone around him was thinking about now. As they led him away, Mark couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. What would happen next? Would this really go any further? His mind was racing, but it felt like he had no control over what was happening anymore. As Mark was led away by the officers, his mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had always heard about how serious the royal guards were, but he never imagined that a harmless prank could turn into such a big problem. He thought for sure that once they realized it was all just a joke, everything would be fine. But the officers hadn't smiled, they hadn't laughed, and they certainly hadn't said anything to calm him down. Mark's thoughts were interrupted when they reached a small room behind the palace gates. The officer who had been guiding him motioned for him to sit on a bench inside. Mark did as he was told, his heart still racing. His stomach felt like it was tied in knots. He couldn't stop thinking about the guard he had thrown coffee on. The guard hadn't reacted at all, and Mark began to wonder if maybe he should have thought things through more carefully. The room was quiet, except for the sound of Mark's heavy breathing. The officer who had spoken to him earlier stood by the door, watching him closely. Mark wanted to say something, to explain that it was all just for fun, but the words wouldn't come out. Every time he tried, the officer's serious look made him nervous, and he quickly fell silent. After a few minutes, the door opened again, and the royal guard from the square stepped into the room. Mark's eyes widened when he saw him. The guard was still wearing the same uniform, though the coffee stains were now visible on his chest. Mark had to fight the urge to apologize right away, but he held back. The guard had been the one to stay silent, not reacting at all. What was going on in his mind? The guard walked toward Mark slowly, his eyes fixed on him. Mark didn't know what to expect. Would the guard shout at him? Would he make him feel even worse for what he had done? But to Mark's surprise, the guard didn't speak at all. He stood there for a moment, then turned to the officer beside him and gave a small nod. The officer nodded back and walked toward Mark. "The royal guard has requested that you remain calm," the officer said. "You'll need to stay here while we sort out what happens next." Mark was confused. He had expected some kind of punishment, or at least an angry word from the guard. But instead, the guard had remained calm and silent. Mark felt a small sense of relief, though he wasn't sure what would happen next. What was the guard thinking? Did he think the joke was funny? Or was he just too professional to show any emotion? Mark wanted to explain himself. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone," he said, his voice quieter now. "It was just supposed to be a joke. I didn't think it would go this far." The officer glanced at him, his face unreadable. "It's not about whether you meant harm," he said. "It's about respect for tradition. You've caused a disturbance, and we need to address it." Mark's mind raced. He had always respected traditions and cultures wherever he went. He had never meant to cause trouble, but now it seemed that the situation was bigger than he had imagined. The officer left the room again, leaving Mark alone with the royal guard. The guard remained silent, his posture still perfect, his face unreadable. Mark wasn't sure if the guard was mad, disappointed, or just indifferent. All Mark knew was that the situation had gotten far more serious than he had ever imagined. As Mark sat alone in the quiet room, the minutes seemed to stretch on forever. His mind raced, replaying the events over and over. He kept asking himself the same questions. What had gone wrong? Why had the prank turned into this mess? At first, he had thought it was all just a funny joke, a harmless way to entertain his friends, a lighthearted way to get a laugh. But now, as the silence stretched on, and the officer and royal guard left him alone, Mark began to feel the weight of the situation. His stomach twisted in knots. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He had made a big mistake. When he had thrown the coffee at the guard, it had felt like a small, silly thing. But now, sitting in this small, quiet room, Mark began to realize that what he had done wasn't as harmless as he had thought. The royal guard was a symbol of authority and tradition, something Mark had known about, but hadn't fully understood until now. His joke hadn't been funny to the guard, it had been disrespectful. The longer Mark thought about it, the more he felt the weight of what he had done. He had thrown hot coffee at someone who was simply doing their job. He hadn't thought about the guard's duty or how his actions might be seen by others. Mark had been so focused on making his moment memorable, on getting a laugh, that he hadn't considered how it might affect the person he was playing the joke on. The guard's silence now made so much more sense. It wasn't about being indifferent or not noticing the prank. It was about holding back a reaction, remaining calm in the face of something unexpected. Mark looked down at his hands, the empty coffee cup still gripped tightly between his fingers, though it no longer felt like a source of amusement. He had been so eager to get attention, to be the center of attention, that he had crossed a line. He had disrespected someone who had earned their place in a role that demanded respect. And now it was clear that the consequences were far bigger than a simple apology could fix. The more he thought about it, the more embarrassed Mark became. He could already imagine the headlines. Tourist pranks Royal Guard, gets arrested. His name would be tied to this for a long time. And the moment he had hoped would be a funny story to share with his friends was now a situation he wished he could undo. As he sat there, waiting for the next step, Mark's thoughts shifted to the guard again. The man had been so calm, so collected. He hadn't shouted, hadn't even shown that he was angry. He had just quietly signaled for help, handling the situation with an impressive level of professionalism. Mark felt a strange mix of admiration and guilt. He admired the guard's ability to stay composed, but he also felt guilty for putting him in a situation where he had to deal with a prank that went too far. Mark had made a serious error, and he was beginning to understand the full weight of his actions. The joke he thought was harmless had turned into a serious issue, and as much as he wished he could take it all back, he knew that wasn't possible. The consequences were unfolding, and there was nothing he could do but face them. The door to the small room creaked open, and Mark's attention snapped toward it. He had been sitting in silence for what felt like hours, his thoughts swirling with guilt and confusion. His mind was still racing as the footsteps of the officer echoed in the hallway. Mark sat up straighter, his heart starting to pound again. What was going to happen next? The officer who had spoken to him earlier entered the room, and this time, his expression was even more serious than before. Mark tried to swallow the nervous lump in his throat, but it felt stuck. The officer's eyes met his, and for a moment, Mark couldn't read his expression. Was this the part where they'd let him go with a warning? Or was there something else coming? "We need to take you into custody," the officer said in a calm but firm voice. Mark's heart skipped a beat. What? No, I didn't mean any harm. It was just a prank. Mark blurted out, his voice shaky. "Please, you have to understand. I never thought it would go this far. It was just a joke." The officer didn't respond to Mark's words. Instead, he motioned for Mark to stand up. "You will have to come with us," the officer repeated, his voice unyielding. Mark's stomach twisted into knots as he stood, still not fully able to comprehend what was happening. He had never been arrested before, never even been close to it. The idea of being taken into custody for something he thought was just a harmless prank felt surreal. This was supposed to be a vacation, a time for fun and laughter. But now, everything was different. The officer stepped aside, and two other officers entered the room. They didn't say a word as they moved toward Mark. The seriousness in their eyes was enough to show that there was no way out of this situation. The cold, hard reality of what he had done began to sink in. Mark glanced back toward the Royal Guard, who was still standing in the corner of the room. The guard's expression was still unreadable, but Mark felt a pang of guilt in his chest. This was all his fault. If he had just kept his prank to himself, if he had thought before acting, none of this would have happened. But now, the consequences were here, and there was nothing he could do but face them. The officers began to walk Mark out of the room and down the hallway. He could feel the eyes of the guards on him, and it made his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He couldn't believe this was his reality now. What had seemed like a funny idea earlier was now turning into a nightmare. As they led him through the back of the palace, and into a waiting vehicle. Mark's mind raced. He kept replaying the events in his head, but no matter how many times he thought about it, he still couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. All he wanted was to make his friends laugh, to get a funny story to tell later. He had never expected something so small to turn into something so serious. The officer closed the door to the vehicle, and Mark sat silently, his hands resting in his lap. The weight of the situation hung over him like a thick cloud. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew that his prank had gone too far, and he was now paying the price for it. The vehicle drove through the city streets, the sound of the wheels on the pavement mixing with the hum of Mark's thoughts. He sat in silence, his mind replaying everything that had happened. The officers had said little during the ride, and Mark could feel the weight of their silence. He was trapped in his own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had gone wrong. The ride seemed to take forever. The buildings outside blurred by as they passed, but Mark wasn't paying much attention. His mind was focused on the situation at hand. How could I have been so stupid? He thought to himself. It had started as a harmless prank, something to make his friends laugh, but now he was facing serious consequences. His chest tightened as he imagined what might come next. What will happen to me? When the vehicle finally came to a stop, Mark was still lost in his thoughts. The officers got out first and opened the door for him. Mark hesitated for a moment before stepping out, his legs feeling heavy. He could hear the faint sound of people talking in the distance, but the street was quieter here, away from the busy square where everything had started. It felt like a different world, and Mark couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. As they walked toward the building, Mark felt his heart race again. This was real. He wasn't just being taken in for a warning. He was being arrested. What was I thinking? He thought. He had never imagined this kind of trouble when he bought that cup of coffee. He thought he was just having a bit of fun, but now he was facing serious consequences. The officers led Mark into a small holding area inside the building. He could see other people there, some sitting in chairs, others pacing back and forth. Mark's stomach twisted, but there was no going back now. He sat down on one of the chairs, his mind still spinning. He could hear the voices of the other people, but their conversations felt far away. It was like he was in a different world, one where his actions had made him an outsider. As he sat there, Mark couldn't stop thinking about the royal guard. What was the guard thinking when Mark had thrown the coffee at him? Had he found it funny? Or was he just too professional to show any emotion? Mark felt a pang of guilt when he thought about how he had treated the guard. He hadn't meant any harm, but it hadn't mattered. The guard had to deal with his prank, and that was something Mark could never take back. Soon, one of the officers returned, this time with a stack of papers in his hands. Mark could see the officer's serious face, and he knew that the next steps were going to be important. He had hoped it would all be over soon, that they would let him go with a warning. But as the officer handed him the papers, Mark knew things were only just beginning. The officer spoke to him quietly. "You'll be appearing in court to explain your actions," he said. Mark swallowed hard. He had no idea what was going to happen, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. He had crossed a line, and now he would have to face the consequences. Mark's mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. He had never been in trouble before, and the weight of his actions was starting to sink in. All he had wanted was to make a funny memory, but now he was dealing with something far bigger than he had imagined. The next few hours felt like an eternity. Mark sat in the holding area, trying to stay calm, but his thoughts were racing. He couldn't stop replaying the events over and over in his head. How did it get so out of hand? He wondered. The feeling of regret was overwhelming. His stomach churned as he thought about how this vacation, which was supposed to be fun and carefree, had turned into this nightmare. He could barely focus on anything else as the officer returned to explain the next steps. The officer told Mark that he would have to wait for his court appearance, where he would explain what had happened. Mark didn't know what to expect. He had never been to court before, and the idea of standing in front of a judge was terrifying. What if they decide to punish me? What if my joke really was too much? Mark knew he couldn't take back what had happened. No matter how much he wished he could go back and undo the prank, it was impossible. He had thrown the coffee, and it had caused a disturbance. He had made a royal guard, someone who was part of the country's traditions, deal with his mistake. Mark was beginning to realize just how serious it had all become. What had seemed like a harmless prank had turned into a much bigger problem. As Mark sat there, he couldn't help but think about the royal guard. The guard had remained calm and composed the entire time. He hadn't reacted with anger, he hadn't yelled, and he hadn't even shown that he was upset. The guard's silence had left a lasting impression on Mark. He thought about how, despite the prank, the guard had stayed professional. Mark admired the guard's ability to remain calm under pressure. In a strange way, the guard had shown Mark what true professionalism looked like. It made Mark feel even more guilty. He had thought the guard would react like the people in the crowd, laughing or getting angry. But the guard had simply done his job. Mark realized that he hadn't respected the guard's role or the tradition he represented. What was meant to be a harmless joke had actually shown a lack of understanding and respect. When the time finally came for Mark to be taken to court, he walked with a heavy heart. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he had learned an important lesson. He understood now that pranks, even ones meant to be funny, could have consequences. What might seem harmless to one person might not feel that way to someone else. As Mark stood in the courtroom, he thought about the guard again. He wished he could apologize, to let the guard know that he never meant any harm. But he knew that was something he would have to do later, after everything had been resolved. For now, all he could do was face the consequences of his actions. The judge listened to the story, and Mark spoke honestly about what had happened. He admitted that it was a poor choice and that he had made a mistake. The judge didn't seem angry, but instead gave Mark a stern reminder about respect for others, especially those in positions of authority. When the hearing was over, Mark was let off with a fine and a warning. It wasn't as bad as he had feared, but it was still a strong reminder that actions have consequences. Mark left the courtroom with a newfound understanding of the importance of thinking before acting. The lesson he had learned that day would stay with him forever. No matter how innocent the joke may seem, it was crucial to consider the impact it could have on others. As he left the courthouse, Mark made a silent promise to himself to always think twice before doing something, especially if it involved someone else. He had learned that some jokes just weren't worth the risk, and he would never make that mistake again. Mark walked out of the courthouse, feeling a strange mixture of relief and regret. The judge had been fair, but Mark couldn't help but think about how his life had changed in such a short time. The fine he had to pay was something he could manage, but the embarrassment of the whole situation was harder to shake off. He had never expected to end up in court over something that seemed so small at first. As he walked down the steps of the courthouse, he thought back to the moment when he had thrown the coffee at the royal guard. At that time, it had felt like nothing more than a silly joke. But now, it seemed so much bigger. He had acted without thinking, without considering the consequences. The idea of a harmless prank had turned into a serious situation, one that affected more than just him. The guard, the officers, and even the people who had witnessed the event had all been part of something that Mark now realized was not so funny. He remembered how calm the guard had been, how he had stayed composed even when Mark had made a mess of things. The guard's silent professionalism had left a lasting impression on him. It made Mark realize just how much respect he had taken for granted. He had failed to respect the role the guard played, and for that, he felt guilty. Mark's friends had sent him messages, worried about how things would turn out. They were surprised when they found out he had been arrested. They couldn't believe that something so simple had led to such a big problem. Some of them tried to comfort him, saying they still thought the joke was funny. But Mark knew better now. He knew that respect for others, especially for people who served important roles in society, was far more important than a quick laugh. He had learned an important lesson that day, one that he would never forget. It wasn't about being careful only when it was convenient. It was about understanding the impact of your actions on others. What had seemed harmless to him had been a disturbance to the guard and the officers, and now Mark had to face the consequences of his thoughtless decision. As Mark left the courthouse and stepped into the fresh air, he realized that this experience had changed him. He would never approach a situation like this again without thinking first. He understood now that actions, even small ones, could have consequences that stretched much further than he ever imagined. In the days that followed, Mark paid the fine and started to put the whole experience behind him. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could learn from it. He kept thinking about how important it was to show respect, not just to people in positions of authority, but to everyone you encounter. It wasn't just about avoiding trouble. It was about doing the right thing. Mark knew he had made a mistake, but he had learned from it, and that was what mattered most. As he moved forward, he was more thoughtful, more aware of the effect his actions could have on others. Mark would never forget the lesson he learned that day. A simple prank had turned into a life lesson, and even though it had been a hard experience, he was thankful for it. He knew that, in the end, it would make him a better person, someone who thought before acting and who always respected others.